It began with a lie. The lie was that China was producing a surplus of food so vast that it would soon surpass the world's most developed nations. The truth was a silence that spread across the countryside, a quiet hunger that would swell into one of the most devastating catastrophes in human history. Between 1959 and 1961, tens of millions of people in China died. The precise figure remains a subject of debate among historians, but the most reliable estimates place the number of premature deaths at around 45 million. This was not a famine born of natural disaster alone, though weather played its part. It was a man-made disaster, a direct consequence of radical political decisions that prioritized ideology over human life. The Great Famine reshaped China's demographic and political landscape for generations. The Great Leap Forward was more than just an economic policy. It was a mass mobilization campaign driven by immense political pressure. Chairman Mao Zedong, emboldened by the success of the Communist Revolution, believed that sheer willpower could conquer obstacles, including the laws of economics and agriculture. The slogan of the era was more faster, better, more economical, but in practice the emphasis was almost entirely on more and faster. Unrealistic production targets were set by the central government and passed down through a rigid hierarchy of provincial and local officials. These targets were not based on careful analysis or scientific data but on political ambition and a competitive frenzy to please the leadership in Beijing. This created a toxic environment where exaggeration became a tool for political survival. Local cadres, fearing punishment for failing quotas, began to systematically inflate grain production reports. A village that harvested 100 tons of wheat might report 200. That satellite of lies traveled up the chain of command. When those falsified figures reached central planners, they were taken as proof of success. Believing the country was awash in grain surplus, the state increased procurement quotas, taking ever larger shares of the harvest for urban consumption, for export, to fund industrial projects, to build up strategic reserves. The more successful a region appeared on paper, the less food was left for the people who actually grew it. At the same time, the campaign demanded a massive diversion of labor away from agriculture. The obsession with overtaking Britain and the United States in steel production led to the backyard furnace movement. Millions of peasants were ordered to abandon their fields and build small, rudimentary village furnaces. They were instructed to melt down any available metal, including cooking pots, farming implements, door knockers. The endeavor was a colossal failure. The steel produced was of such poor quality it was almost entirely useless. A central pillar of the Great Leap Forward was the forced collectivization of agriculture into people's communes. In an astonishingly short period, over 750,000 agricultural cooperatives were merged into approximately 26,000 communes, each comprising thousands of households. This was a radical social experiment. It aimed to eradicate private ownership and to erase family life. Private plots of land that had given families extra food were confiscated. Livestock became communal property. Tools became communal property. Cooking utensils became communal property. The traditional family structure was deliberately undermined. Life in the communes was organized along military lines. People were roused by bugle calls. They marched to the fields in work brigades, and they ate in large, impersonal, communal canteens. For a brief period, they offered free, unlimited food. That led to rapid, wasteful depletion of grain reserves. When food ran out, canteens became instruments of control. The sick were often denied rations. So were those who fell out of favor. The Great Leap Forward was characterized by a profound arrogance toward nature encapsulated in the slogan, "Man must conquer nature." This ideology led to radical, unproven agricultural techniques dictated by the central government and enforced on peasants across the country. These policies were based on the pseudo-scientific theories of Trofim Lysenko presented as revolutionary breakthroughs, but in reality, they were a recipe for ecological disaster. Farmers with generations of local knowledge were forced to abandon traditional methods and adopt these new, untested practices. One of the most destructive was close planting. It was based on the flawed idea that plants of the same class would not compete. Cadres ordered seeds to be planted at densities 5 to 10 times greater than normal. The actual result was the opposite. The overcrowded seedlings choked each other out, competing for limited light, water, and soil nutrients. Precious seeds were wasted on a massive scale, contributing directly to the food shortages that would follow. Another disastrous policy was deep plowing. As the famine deepened, the daily lives of ordinary people in the Chinese countryside became a relentless, desperate search for anything that could be eaten. The communal canteens, which had once dispensed food freely, soon ran out of grain. Rations were cut again and again, until they consisted of little more than a watery gruel, barely enough to sustain life. Hunger became the central organizing principle of existence. It was a constant, gnawing presence that clouded every thought and sapped every ounce of energy. People grew gaunt, their skins stretched tight over their bones. The physical effects were devastating, swollen limbs from edema, dizziness, and a profound lethargy that made even the simplest tasks feel monumental. The villages fell into a deathly silence, the usual sounds of life replaced by the quiet weakness of starvation. The search for food drove people to extremes. When the grain was gone, they turned to wild plants, digging for roots, stripping leaves from trees, grinding corn cobs and rice husks into a coarse flour to fill their empty stomachs. As these resources were exhausted, they began to eat things that were never meant for human consumption. Tree bark was boiled into a bitter soup. Geese feather grass and other weeds were scavenged from the fields. In the most desperate regions, people ate mud, a type of clay called guanyin soil, which provided a temporary feeling of fullness, but had no nutritional value and often led to fatal intestinal blockages. The landscape was stripped bare as millions of starving people scoured it for any possible source of sustenance. Amidst the overwhelming horror of the famine, there were countless small, unrecorded acts of courage, sacrifice, resilience. These stories, passed down through families or recorded decades later, provide a glimpse into the human spirit's refusal to be entirely extinguished by hunger. One such story is that of a mother in a village in Anhui province. Her husband had been taken away to work on a failed irrigation project and had never returned. Left with 2 young children and no food, she would walk for miles every day to a nearby mountain where she knew a certain type of edible leaf grew. She would boil these leaves into a thin, bitter soup, always giving the largest share to her children, telling them it was a special kind of vegetable to keep them strong. She herself wasted away, but her children survived the famine, a living legacy of her silent, daily sacrifice. Another account tells of an elderly village doctor who had managed to hide a small bag of rice from the collectivization raids. Instead of keeping it for himself, he used it as a secret medicine. When a child in the village fell gravely ill from malnutrition, he would visit the family in the dead of night. He managed to save several children in this way before his own supply ran out. These were not grand gestures, but in the context of the famine, they were acts of profound heroism. The Great Famine was not simply a lack of food, it was a crisis engineered and exacerbated by a rigid and brutal bureaucracy. The system of state procurement was the primary mechanism through which the countryside was bled dry. Based on the wildly inflated production figures, reported by local cadres, the central government set mandatory grain quotas that often exceeded the entire actual harvest of a village. To meet these impossible targets, local officials deployed militias to conduct house-to-house raids. The grain that peasants had secretly set aside for their families to survive the winter was confiscated and shipped away. This system was enforced with systematic and terrifying violence. Peasants suspected of hiding grain, or unable to meet labor quotas due to weakness, were subjected to brutal punishment. A wide array of torture methods was used to extract confessions or make examples. The level of violence reflected the immense pressure on local officials. Granaries in many counties were full of confiscated grain, but remained locked under government seal. The state prioritized political and industrial ambitions over citizens' lives. By late 1960 and early 1961, the scale of the disaster could no longer be completely hidden, even from the top leadership in Beijing. Reports from secret investigative teams painted evidence of collapse across provinces. A reluctant and partial retreat from the radical policies began to take shape. The government quietly started to reduce the size of the communes, decentralizing decision-making to smaller production teams, which more closely resembled the original villages. One critical change was the partial restoration of private plots. These plots provided vital nutrition and slowly pulled families back from the brink. In a major reversal, China imported large quantities of grain from Western countries, Canada, Australia. These imports, from 1961, helped stabilize urban food supplies. Pragmatic leaders took charge of recovery. The Great Chinese Famine stands as one of modern history's most profound and cautionary tales. Its primary lesson is a stark warning about the dangers of utopian ideology when it is untethered from reality and combined with absolute political power. Good policy must be based on facts, feedback, and a willingness to adapt, not on slogans and ideological purity. The famine was a catastrophe of lies. Ultimately, the Great Famine is a memorial to the tens of millions of lives senselessly lost, a debt that can only be honored by learning its lessons. We must remember those who starved, not just as statistics, but as individuals, and we must resolve that history, in all its horror, must never be allowed to repeat itself.